everyone. Welcome back to the Becoming Anchor podcast. We're so glad that you're here with us. I am Lauren Jackson. This is Laura Deneen. We are two licensed therapists in the Brentwood, Tennessee area. We work in a group private practice where we treat everything from eating disorders to anxiety, depression, grief and loss, OCD. We work with clients as young as 6 all the way through the lifespan. We really love what we do. And we're super excited to continue reaching you guys on this platform and connecting with y'all this way. And we're pumped for this episode today.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So Lauren came to me, for those of you that are new to this podcast, around 12 months ago, so almost a year ago now, and expressed interest in starting a podcast. And I was like, of course, let's do it. So the purpose of this podcast is twofold. It's really, first and foremost, to share our real life experiences. So we are humans before we are therapists, and we certainly have pain, and we also have joy, and we're here just to ride the waves of life with y'all. And then we also have this unique perspective of being therapists. And so we really want to talk about the stories that we hear and some of the wisdom that we've gleaned from those moments of sitting with clients.
Quick disclaimer. This is for informational purposes only. So the content here in this podcast and all of our episodes is not to be replaced with therapy itself. So if you find that as you're listening and engaging with this content that you might benefit from therapy, please find someone local to you. Or if you're local to us, reach out. We would love to connect.
So let's go ahead and get started. Today, we are going to be talking about intrapersonal boundaries. Love a good boundary. So it's funny because when I went to grad school, and even I feel like this is something that's come up for me in recent years, I knew that we could have boundaries with other people, but I didn't necessarily fully understand or grasp this idea of intrapersonal boundaries. So I'm using that word intrapersonal as this idea of boundaries with myself. And more commonly understood, I think, in our culture is boundaries with other people. But I think boundaries with ourselves is a topic that maybe we don't talk about enough. And so that's why we wanted to cover it today. So when I think of a boundary, one of the ways that I love to think of a boundary, or maybe even educate clients on a boundary, is kind of this concept of where I end and you begin. So almost like a hula hoop, right? So it's my physical space, my emotional space, my mental, relational, spiritual space. I could never personally get the hula hoop to keep turning when I was little. I tried so hard. But anyway, I always get up and do that example with clients. And they're like, Laura, what are you doing? I'm like, don't worry about it. It's fine. And for those of you that know me and are listening, I'm sure you can just picture this in my office. But yeah, I mean, boundaries with other people are really, really important. And that's a whole nother episode, or maybe a series of episode, or a season in and of itself. But today we really wanted to talk about boundaries with ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, Lauren, when you think about this topic, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I feel like it is just now, and I say just now, maybe that's not the right term to use, but really kind of recently becoming more of a topic of conversation amongst people, is just this idea of boundaries, in relationship, and that's now becoming a cool thing to do and a cool thing to talk about. And that's amazing. And I think just as we continue to evolve in the mental health space, I think that conversation will continue to evolve as well. But yeah, this idea of boundaries with self, I think maybe it can be a little bit confusing to people. I think it's easier to understand or kind of wrap your mind around, even if you grew up not really learning how to have boundaries, or not being modeled boundaries, and not having boundaries now. It's still kind of can be something fairly easy-ish to wrap your mind around, saying no to someone and, that kind of thing. But when it comes to boundaries with self, I think that can feel a little bit confusing to people. And so if you're out there and you're like, yeah, what the heck is a boundary with yourself? Like, just to validate that. Yeah, I think what comes up for me first and foremost is, and this is true for boundaries with self or boundaries relationally. So in interpersonal versus intrapersonal, we're talking about intrapersonal, is we have got to be connected to ourself. Like, we have to have bodily, emotional connection and awareness. Because if we don't, then how do we know that we need to have a boundary? How do we know that we need to say no? Or how do we know that we can say yes? Or how do we know that that person doesn't feel safe? Or how do we know that that thing is okay to do? If we don't know what we're feeling, if we don't know what we're, what's going on internally. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
100%. Yeah. It's like cultivating insight, self-awareness. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot on the show about what we're noticing in ourselves. So it's noticing that physical sensation I'm having when I'm around that person, or, just cultivating more self-awareness in order to even set the boundary with myself. Right. So this actually came up recently in a session for me, but clients will oftentimes talk about being tired all the time, which, if you struggle with chronic fatigue, or if you are in a place of just experiencing fatigue right now, my heart goes out to you, first and foremost. And a lot of times there's maybe not a connection with themselves around, I'm saying yes to all these things, and I don't necessarily understand how that's connected to my fatigue, right? Mm-hmm. And so we would start with that body awareness around, hey, let's talk about your fatigue, and let's first validate that it's okay to be tired. We don't have to judge yourself. We don't have to shame you for being tired. But what might be happening in your world that's leading to this sense of ongoing fatigue? And just a quick caveat, I know that there's lots of different, health conditions that can lead to fatigue, and so I'm certainly not speaking on those today. But that would be a boundary, looking at boundaries with myself. So that would be, maybe in that example, I just used boundaries with my time. And you could take this a lot of different directions, right? But it could be, and in therapy, why am I saying yes when I really mean no? And maybe I need to go home and go to sleep early. Maybe I'm going out to dinner with friends 5 nights a week, and maybe I need to have a boundary with myself that during a work week, I do one evening out with friends. And for a lot of people, I think this can feel really scary, because this kind of way of doing life is all that they know. So the idea of like setting a boundary with myself feels foreign, like you were talking about. It feels confusing. It feels scary, because there's risk in it, right? Like, if I don't say yes to my friends because I need to really work on some of this fatigue I'm experiencing, am I going to lose connection? Am I not going to get invited the next time? Are they going to be mad at me? It's like all these different things that can come up from this one concept of setting a boundary with myself, of going to sleep earlier, right? So I just want to acknowledge that, right? It's all these things that can kind of be a trickle effect or a ripple effect from that idea of going to bed earlier, which is a boundary with your time, a boundary with yourself.
Yeah, another, I feel like, important ingredient, if you will, to setting boundaries effectively with self. So along with that self-awareness piece, that self-insight of physical and emotional happenings going on, is like self-compassion or kindness to self. Because if I'm only ever operating out of my inner critic, then there's probably not room to set a boundary. If I'm only ever operating out of shame doesn't typically tend towards boundaries, and because boundaries tend towards care, right? Boundaries tend towards protection. Boundaries tend towards nurture, and our shame, our inner critic doesn't. They're in opposition. Their values are in opposition to each other, and so I talk with my clients a lot about self-compassion, and I also acknowledge that this phrase self-compassion can kind of be thrown around a little bit like cliche and flippantly, and just self-love and whatever, and there's so much more of a depth of work there that can happen and needs to happen for really in order for us to be able to set boundaries well intrapersonally. Shame and boundaries just don't really go together.
Yeah. 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 Well, and to like the longevity of this work, right? We want the personal boundaries to last a long time and to be sustainable, right? And so shame, like you talked about, is in opposition to that. And yeah, I mean, I love that idea. And yes, the depth of the self-compassion work. So just to kind of speak to that a little bit, Lauren's really referencing, what we come up against in session is clients that will say things like, I don't deserve self-compassion, or if I am compassionate to myself, does that mean that I'm giving up on myself, or kind of that dichotomous thinking. Or maybe they've never experienced kindness from a caregiver growing up. And so giving yourself self-compassion in the boundary process, in the context of setting boundaries with yourself, can just feel so new and foreign, and kind of there's like this deservedness layer that comes up with that. Yeah. One thing that I love to talk to clients about is that boundaries can be fluid, in the sense that we can always change our mind when we set boundaries with ourselves, right? So I think sometimes when we think about a boundary, and I certainly have done this in my own life, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's going to be this way forever. Because our brains love to do this like all or nothing thinking. And so even with boundaries, we can play with it. And that the playfulness of that also invites a spirit of curiosity, a spirit of self-compassion. But, back to that example of boundaries with myself in the sense of my time. If I decide, okay, going out to eat dinner 5 nights a week especially during the work week, is too much for me, and maybe I scale back to 1 night a week, but maybe I really am an extrovert and that doesn't feel nurturing to me, and so I want to bump it up to 2, right? Like that's an example of being able to change our minds with our boundaries. And different life events can cause this, different stressors that we go through. And so this is back to what you referenced in the beginning of session, right? It's attunement to what's happening internally in our bodies, so that we know when we need to maybe change a boundary with ourselves.
Totally. Yeah. I was just about to say that the more in tune we become with ourselves physically, emotionally, mentally, blah, 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 the more fluid we can be with our boundaries, the more curious we can be with how they need to move, when they need to move, playing around with that. This actually came up not too long ago with a client, and I guess you could argue that this is like inter and intrapersonal boundaries, and I think that there can be some interchanging of the two, but something came up between her and her husband, and I think he like asked, do you want to talk about it? And she said, no, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it right now. So I pointed out, it sounds like you were setting a boundary. And then she was like, yeah. And then later I thought about it some more, and I was like, oh, I actually do need to talk about this, because I know that if I go to bed and I haven't had a conversation, then I'm going to feel really anxious. I'm going to have a hard time sleeping. So I went and had the conversation. So I just really highlighted for her, and we literally talked about this topic of like fluidity with boundaries, because she knew what she needed, because she was listening to herself. And I was like, and so we just like celebrated that together, because that was a cool moment for her.
Yeah, that's part of the work we do in therapy, is like pointing out wins, right? That's one of the reasons we go to therapy, obviously, to talk about the pain and suffering and the wounds that we've experienced, or maybe the problematic behaviors that we're going through. But we also go to therapy to have someone who's like our biggest cheerleader pointing out moments of celebration, which it sounds like you did with your client. Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of times people are like, what does an intrapersonal boundary mean? So I know we talked about, time, a couple other examples that are coming to mind just to kind of get y'all's juices flowing, so to speak, if you're listening to the show. So finances, right? So having intrapersonal boundaries are, really approaching my financial state versus avoiding. I know I can tend to avoid number stuff just with my own history, but really having a good grasp on, okay, if I'm overspending, or maybe I don't ever allow myself to buy something fun, right? So boundaries can mirror a lot of different things in our lives. We go to extremes, right? So we can have rigid or porous boundaries. So what I mean by that is just rigid, y'all can deduce, but porous is kind of not enough boundaries with ourselves, right? So something, looking at our finances can be just really helpful. Boundaries with our sleep. So am I staying up scrolling until 1 a.m. when I have a 8 o'clock meeting? You know, something as simple as like brushing my teeth twice a day or making the choice to floss. Those kind of things can all be examples of boundaries with ourselves. Or I'm going to make the choice to go to therapy once every other week because it's helps me be the best boss or wife or friend or colleague or whatever it might be. So those are all examples of boundaries with myself that feel pertinent to this conversation that I just wanted to share with y'all so that you could start thinking about those on your own time after the show.
Yeah, I think it's helpful too when we're thinking about setting boundaries internally, like with ourselves, for us to have an understanding around like why we're setting the boundary. I think that why is really helpful because it reminds us of what we are trying to protect, or it reminds us of or it keeps us in line with with our value system around what is important to us. So like, flossing your teeth every day, or brushing your teeth twice a day, because we use that example, maybe isn't always the most fun thing to do, or it would be just so much easier to just like get in the bed and whatever. And the why is keeping you close to that value of oral health. I don't know, right?
Well, sure. And even like deeper,
Right.
It's like the connection. Like I would care about my teeth because I want to be
Right.
here and, I want to
Totally
be around my family long term or something like that, right?
Yeah, so maybe that's a surface example, but I think we could still go with it, and I think just that value piece. Laura and I really practice from a values-based lens with our clients, and we also try as best we can to live a values-based life, and so that feels important and foundational to this podcast and the content that we bring to you guys. And so I think, bringing these topics back to how they help us live in line with our values feels significant and important to what it means to becoming anchored, and just that process that we're always on together.
Yeah. And, we talked about the riding the waves, like kind of to recap here, like Lauren's saying, we have to go back to our why. And we also have to acknowledge that setting boundaries oftentimes can be a pretty hard, strenuous process in the sense of sometimes it's harder to do with short term. We talk a lot about short term and long term outcomes and or consequences. Those are two different ways to think about it. But in the short run, your friends may be disappointed, like that you aren't going to dinner, or that first example we used, right? So that might cause you to have an emotion that you have to work through, right? Or you can work through in your therapy session. But yeah, boundaries, when we start setting boundaries, if they're new to us, it can feel really hard. And I know that's part of my story as well. Like, I didn't know what a boundary was when I first started my recovery process. And I wasn't on, I don't know if Instagram was a thing then. I don't think it was. But anyway, I didn't have all the psychoeducation now that's out there in the world. And so when my therapist told me about a boundary, I was like, oh my gosh, I was excited and also fearful. I kind of was like, there were both inside of me responding. But yeah, I think boundaries, it can be really hard, especially the short term. Maybe there's going to be some pain. Maybe there's going to be some tough conversations. But long term, the goal is to experience some more, like Lauren's saying, values-based life, and to experience hopefully more joy, more contentedness. So that's the that's kind of tagging along as far as the why of us setting boundaries. So we hope this was helpful for y'all today. It felt important to talk about an affirmation. So y'all know that we always close. If you're new to the episode, we close with an affirmation and homework. So your affirmation today is that I can trust my intuition in setting appropriate boundaries with myself. And then Lauren is going to follow up with your homework.
Yeah, so your homework, you probably can guess, is practice setting an intrapersonal boundary this week. So a couple of steps before that would be practicing some self-awareness and insight, and practicing some self-compassion, so that those two things can help inform you maybe where you need an intrapersonal boundary.
I love it. Thanks for being here, guys. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.